person. Otherwise, you're not there. Almost good. And that was the very slide. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm getting signals from the row up there that we can start. So we're all clear. My name is Serhiy Plokhy. I am a professor of Ukrainian history here at Harvard and director of the Ukrainian Research Institute. And it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce today's lecture and our today's speaker. So first, a few words about the lecture. The lecture is supported by a fund donated by the estate of the late Vasil and Maria Petryshin, as well as their son, Dr. Volodymyr Petryshin, and other family members. That sort of support, financial support that was at the beginning of the foundation of the Ukrainian program and Ukrainian studies here at Harvard, and we are certainly very much appreciate that support. The Petryshin Memorial Lecture is given annually by a distinguished scholar with national or international reputation in the field of Ukrainian studies. Very often it's both national and international. And I'm especially pleased to introduce our today's speaker, Anne Applebaum. We hear again and again that some speakers, and this is certainly true for Anne Applebaum, doesn't need introduction, but that's probably why Megan and Christina allowed me to introduce you. Whatever I misread here or mispronounce, there will be not much damage. People know who you are. So I'll start, as we always start here at Harvard, with education. And Anne went to little small university here in the neighborhood, Yale University, with BA and graduated with BA in history and literature, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, in both majors, in history and literature. And she then went to the London School of Economics and today has honorary doctorates from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and Kyiv-Mohyla University in Ukraine. She started her career as a journalist back in the late 1980s, at the time when the Berlin Wall was already getting ready to fall. The major transitions in the region, in the Soviet Union, but also in Eastern Europe were happening at that time. She started as a Warsaw correspondent for The Economist, then went on there to become Africa editor, and in her career wrote for a number of major publications in UK and in the United States, served on the editorial board of the Washington Post, was a columnist at the same newspaper, is a staff writer at the Atlantic Today, and also is a senior fellow at the Agora Institute and the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. But probably much more importantly than anything that I said so far has been Anne Applebaum's output, and in particular, it happens on the weekly basis, on the daily basis, but also she finds time to put her thoughts and share her insights with us, with readers, through the award-winning books. Gulag: A History is a Pulitzer Prize winner for the general nonfiction. Iron Curtain got a number of prizes, Candle History Prize, Arthur Ross Silver Medal Award. Red Famine, the book that we at the Institute were really very happy to share our expertise on the Ukrainian famine with Anne, got 2 prizes, Duff Cooper Prize and Lionel Gelber Prize. For those of you who are history department students and had a mistake of taking of one or two of my courses, you know that for the field preparation for PhD students, I have a list of works and publications, and there is only one book there that is not written by quote unquote professional historian. But certainly an author who provides really in her books a combination of insight, knowledge of the literature and the discussions that are going there with the attention to detail, to human stories, so brings the history in its fullness, at least in my understanding. And today, Anne Applebaum writes history of this war, the history of Russo-Ukrainian war. I don't know what will be the overall and ultimate outcome, but we certainly follow and your publications. And this is one of the aspects of the war that you are going to talk about today. So the title is "They Didn't Understand Anything, Just Spoiled People's Lives, Brutality, Incompetence, and Historical Echoes in Russian-occupied Ukraine." So and again, it's a great honor to welcome you.
Thank you so much, Serhii. One of the things he didn't mention, which perhaps he should have said, was that my book Red Famine was really invented here. Actually, do you think we could turn it off so that I don't hear the echo? So yeah. My book Red Famine was really invented here at Harvard. It was actually his idea that I write it. And it was Serhii's idea that I write it, and it was the resources of HURI, of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, that allowed me to do it. And so I owe a debt of gratitude to you, to the people from the Institute who are in the room, who persuaded me to do it, and then helped me access material in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine that was relevant. And of course, it was really that book, which at the time seemed like a somewhat obscure research project, maybe not part of the mainstream story of European history. At least that's how many people treated it and how people thought of it. It turns out that the story of the history of Ukraine is now understood correctly to be far more central to the story of Europe than anybody thought at the time. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm happy to be here at really what I think of as one of the great intellectual centers of the study of Europe, not just Ukraine, for exactly this reason, because this is one of the institutions that understood why Ukraine is important and why it matters to bigger, larger geopolitical stories before anybody else did. Let me start my talk today on the night of February the 24th, 2022. On that night, the sound of missiles jolted Viktor Marunyak awake. He saw flashes in the sky and billowing black smoke. Then he got dressed and went to work. Marunyak is the mayor of Staroburivka, a village just across the Dnipro River from Kherson, and he headed immediately to an emergency meeting with the leaders of other small towns from other nearby villages in the region to discuss their options. They very quickly realized that they were too late to connect with the Ukrainian army. Their region was cut off and they were occupied. And occupied is a word that conjures up a specific set of emotions. Here in America, I think it makes us think of Nazi-occupied Europe and maybe black and white photographs of Wehrmacht officers striding through Paris. Further east, people remember two occupations, of course, Nazi and Soviet. But in both cases, the stories from these occupations have felt for at least two generations as if they belong to the past. In 2012, before Red Famine, I published a book called Iron Curtain, which was about the Soviet occupation of Central Europe from 1944 to 1956. And at the time I wrote that book, I was convinced that I was writing a book about the past. a story that was over, that could now be told, that was accessible through archives. I wasn't writing a book about the present or the future. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in last February, it's become pretty clear that the past, in the famous saying, the past isn't even past, and in the territories of the old Soviet Empire, that's true in a stunning and shocking way. So in many different ways, the policies that are being carried out by Russian soldiers in Ukraine strongly resemble the policies carried out by Soviet soldiers in occupied Central Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, in the Baltic states, in Czechoslovakia after 1945. There are some nuances and some differences, and as I'm going to explain, but it's pretty clear that the old NKVD playbook, which is now the FSB playbook, is still in use. So how to subjugate a population, how to change its habits, how to even change its identity. These are all things that have been tried before, and they are being tried again now. Let me just add that in this lecture, I'm going to draw on the work of a really extraordinary organization called the Reckoning Project. Over the past 10 months, the Reckoning Project has deployed more than a dozen journalists and field researchers to record detailed testimonies of victims and of witnesses in areas of Ukraine that are or were under Russian occupation. Lawyers and analysts then seek to verify these accounts. One of their goals is to provide evidence that will be admissible in future court proceedings. But the point is also to collect stories that can be used by journalists and perhaps eventually historians like some of you in this room, in order to enhance our understanding of what's happened in the last year. I worked with them to understand the nature of this contemporary occupation and its relationship to the behavior of Soviet forces in Soviet occupations in the past. But let me now return to the mayor of Starozburivka. So he had been expecting the war to break out. Many people in Ukraine did, but he had no sense of what a Russian occupation of his village would mean. So like his colleagues, Marunyak is an elected official. He's genuinely elected since 2006 under Ukrainian laws that give real power to local governments. So he wasn't appointed following a falsified plebiscite as a similar official might have been in the Soviet era or might be in modern Russia. And so that meant that when the occupation began, he felt an enormous responsibility to stay in Starozburivka and to help his constituents cope with what was a cascade of emergencies. So as he said, already within a few days, there were families lacking food, he recalled. There was no bread or flour, so I was trying to buy grain from the farmers. Many residents began contributing food they could share, and so we created a fund providing assistance on demand. Very similar kinds of plans were made to locate and distribute medications, and because the Ukrainian police had ceased to function in that area, ordinary citizens also formed nighttime patrols, security patrols, and they staffed them with local volunteers. And Marunyak prepared to negotiate with whoever the Russians were going to send to Starozburivka. And he said, I told people not to be afraid, saying that when the Russians would come, I'll be the first to talk to them. And he was, and he paid a really horrific price for it. So the Russian soldiers who arrived in Kherson, like the Russian soldiers who arrived in Bucha and Irpin, in the Kharkiv region, in Zaporizhia, or anywhere else in Ukraine, were not prepared to beat people like Marunyak. Some initially had not known they were even invading a foreign country. Famously, they were told they were going on maneuvers and they didn't realize when they had crossed the border what they were doing. But many others believed that they were entering they were entering a territory that was ruled by a small, insecure, and unpopular Ukrainian elite. And their actions suggest that their immediate goal was to decapitate that elite, to arrest them, to deport them, or to kill them. And clearly, they did not expect this to be difficult. It's well known that they intended to murder the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, but it seems that they also believed that other Ukrainian leaders lower down the political hierarchy would then flee or simply be easily toppled as well. As I've already said, this theory of occupation was not new. So Soviet soldiers entering the territory of Eastern Poland or the Baltic states during World War II also arrived with lists of names, as well as the lists of the types of people that they wanted to arrest. So in May 1941, Stalin himself provided such a list for occupied Poland. And to the Soviet dictator, anyone linked to the Polish state, meaning police, army officers, leaders of political parties, civil servants, their families, was a counter-revolutionary or a kulak or a bourgeois, or to put it more simply, an enemy to be eliminated. Russia made similar lists before invading Ukraine a year ago, some of which have become known. Again, Ukraine's president, prime minister, and other leaders featured on them, as did well-known journalists and activists. Some of these people received warnings from the US government in advance of the invasion because US intelligence got hold of some of those lists. So we know they existed, we know who was on them. But even though they had the names of famous or well-known people, Russian soldiers were not prepared to encounter widespread popular resistance, and they certainly did not expect to find loyal, conscientious, popularly elected small town and village mayors. And so perhaps that explains why Marunyak, who was age 60, was punished with such horrific cruelty after the Russians arrested him on March 21st. So along with a few other local men, the mayor was kept blindfolded and handcuffed for 3 days. Russian soldiers beat him. They gave him nothing to eat or drink. One time he was stripped naked and forced to stay in the cold for several hours. A gun was held to his head and he was threatened with drowning. He was told that his wife and daughters would be captured. Once he said the soldiers choked him until he lost consciousness, and they kept demanding to know where he kept his weapons. And this, of course, is the important point, because Marunyak fit into no category that the Russians could recognize, perhaps even because his local patriotism and his civic mindedness seemed strange to them. They decided that he, excuse me, he must be a secret member of a Ukrainian sabotage group, but of course he was not. He had no weapons and no military skills at all. Days into his detention, Marunyak was briefly able to see his wife, Katya, before he was transferred to Kherson. The soldiers told Katya that she would not see her husband for 20 years. He was then sent right into another torture chamber where a different set of Russian soldiers tied wires to his thumbs. In this form of torture, wires are connected to a victim's fingers or toes or sometimes genitals. Electric shocks are then delivered using the battery of a field telephone. According to one witness, soldiers described this as making a call to Putin. The practice of electrocuting electrocuting prisoners is not new. It was used during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and also in Russia's Chechen wars, and it is now used once again very widely in occupied Ukraine. But here's another important point, that even when Marunyak was tortured and interrogated, he noticed that his captors never wrote anything down. Their questioning was sloppy. He couldn't work out what it was they really wanted to learn, possibly nothing. And eventually, after days of captivity, again, with next to no food and with, torture and cold and isolation, he was freed with 9 broken ribs and pneumonia. He escaped the occupied zone, and he is now living outside of Ukraine. My colleagues at the Reckoning Project have found that these kinds of experiences are not unusual. So another mayor, the mayor of Milove, Oleg Yakinenko, mayor of another village in the Kherson region, was detained twice as well. Olena Peleshok, the mayor of Zilony Pod, was imprisoned for more than 2 months. Mikhailo Burak, the mayor of Bekhteri village, was detained and tortured. In the former occupied territory of Kharkiv alone, police investigators have evidence of 25 torture chambers. And the Ukrainian government believes that mayors, deputy mayors, and other local leaders from a majority of the Kherson region's 49 municipalities were arrested or kidnapped. Many have disappeared, and we simply don't know where they are, whether they're in Russia, whether they're dead, whether they're in another part of occupied Ukraine. Many of their stories share not only gruesome details, but also an atmosphere of unreality. So Ukrainian captives were told that the Ukrainian state had discriminated against them for speaking Russian, and now they were free. So this was something repeatedly said by the invaders. But when Russian-speaking mayors and other elected officials flatly explained that no one in Ukraine had harmed them for using their native language, which was Russian in that part of Ukraine for many people, or that Russian was widely spoken in the region, the soldiers didn't have any response. Dmytro Vasilyev, who's the secretary of the city council of occupied Novokhovka, recalled that his Russian was more fluent and is more grammatical than the Russian of the soldier interrogating him. The soldier was a Kalmyk, one of Russia's minority groups, and Vasilyev had been born in Moscow. He considered himself a Ukrainian of ethnic Russian extraction, which confused them. They couldn't comprehend, he said, why I, Russian by ethnic origin, did not want to cooperate them. Vasilyev recalled, I said, how can I look into the eyes of my son and my colleagues if I become a traitor? They just didn't get it. Since his interview with the Reckoning Project, Vasilyev has died possibly as a result of the health consequences he suffered while under interrogation. But even as they inflicted pain on the most civic-minded Ukrainians, Ukrainians who considered themselves part of the political nation of Ukraine, whatever their ethnic background, even as they assaulted these local leaders, Russian soldiers also seemed not to know how to replace them. So in this case, again, unlike their Soviet communist forebears, who could at least name the ideology that had driven them into Poland or Estonia or Romania, the modern Russian army seems to have no coherent theory of government or administration, no concrete plans to run the region, not even any really clear idea of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, this phrase that some of President Putin's ideologues extol. They don't know what it means. They don't know how to bring it about. They don't know who would create it or how that would happen. When the Red Army arrived in Poland, for example, in 44 and 45, it had allies to work with. It worked with the tiny Polish Communist Party, many of whose leaders had been trained in Moscow for that purpose. In this war, Russian forces do find collaborators to replace elected officials, but many of them appear to be completely random, unqualified people with no discernible ideology. Some have only recently emerged as potential collaborators, and many had no previously known links to Russia. In some places, the invaders have displayed Soviet symbols or flags, perhaps hoping that these older ideas will somehow create some feeling of brotherhood or some sense of shared history. But mostly they don't offer anything. There's no explanation, there are no improvements to life, there's not even a competent administration. They do this immense damage, but they don't seem to know why. But I should say that the mayors and town councilors and other elected officials are not the only ones who are targeted. So the occupiers are also disturbed by another category of Ukrainian, and these are the volunteers. So the people who run charities, people who run civic organizations, people who spontaneously rush to help others, and people who cooperated with the mayor, for example, in his early efforts to set up a food bank or to create a medical bank or to create local patrols. Perhaps they seem suspicious to Russian officials because their own country crushes spontaneity, independent associations, and grassroots movements. The Reckoning Project interviewed a man from Skadovsk, which is a part of Kherson province, still under Russian control, whom I'm going to call Volunteer A because he's requested anonymity because he fears for his family's safety. He had been a member of one of the neighborhood watch groups that stepped in to replace the police. And he'd worked at exactly one of these things at a humanitarian aid distribution center. After his father was arrested in April 2022, a few weeks into the occupation, Volunteer A went to find him and he was detained as well. What's interesting is that during his subsequent interrogation, he was asked about other local activists and about his connection to Ukrainian security services, which he didn't have, to the CIA, which he had even fewer connections to, and even ludicrously, George Soros's Open Society foundations. So like the Soviet officials who once treated Boy Scout troops in occupied Central Europe as if they were automatic members of a conspiracy, the Russians seem incredulous to discover that he was literally just a local volunteer working with other local volunteers. And their questions made it seem as if they'd never heard of such a thing. So he recalled being beaten simultaneously by 4 different men, struck by a baseball bat, tormented with those same kinds of electric shocks, hit with a hammer, in an effort to get him to admit that he was part of a larger conspiracy. And in his case, at least one of his ribs was broken. And after the interrogation, he was told to make a video confession and to sign a statement declaring that he would not spread fake news about the Russian occupation. After a subsequent detention, he too escaped the occupied territories. In another town in the Kherson region, another volunteer, Volunteer B, we'll call him, had a similar experience. Before Russian forces detained him, he'd been running a makeshift pharmacy that collected medical supply donations. And he too was interrogated, and he too was beaten. And like Volunteer A, he was asked repeatedly about the true purpose of this charitable work. Who was organizing it? Who was behind it? Was there a greater links? Was he part of a bigger organization? And once again, the Russian soldiers seemed unable to believe that no secret group was behind it, that ordinary people were spontaneously contributing to this common project, that information about it was simply spread by word of mouth on social media and on the radio, and that there was not a larger, darker plot. He was even asked to jot down a description of how his group worked. So the way it worked, he recalled writing, was that most people brought what they had and got what they needed, provided that we have it. And that's how it worked. And the Russians kept pressing for more details of this non-existence conspiracy. Eventually they gave up, but they did confiscate the painkillers he'd accumulated, which had been destined for cancer patients. This man, who was also forced to leave his region, now believes that the interrogators' real problem was that they feared that volunteers like him and others were outside their control. So it really pisses them off, the Russians off. It annoys them, he said, that anyone can be independent of the state and of the political system, any political system. And this helps explain why the list of arrested and tortured volunteers is so long, and why their testimonies are so similar across the various zones of occupation. So I'm telling a lot of stories from the Kherson region, but the very similar ones come out of the area north of Kiev, where the Russians were briefly in charge, out from Kharkiv and elsewhere. Ruslan Mashkov, a Ukrainian Red Cross volunteer, was detained by Russian soldiers north of Kiev in March and interrogated. A woman in the Kherson region who had helped sort humanitarian aid packages told an interviewer that she had been arrested, given electrical shocks, robbed of her money, and beaten. Nakhmet Ismailov, another Kherson resident who had organized charity concerts and benefits before the war, was also tortured with electric shocks. So anybody who conducted any independent activity, anyone who engages with anything that looks like what we would call civil society, or who might be described as a social entrepreneur or an employee of a charity, is at risk in an occupation zone that is run by men who have never encountered a genuine charity or a genuine volunteer organization before at all. But I would say the nihilism of this invasion is particularly notable in the incoherent approach to the Ukrainian educational system. So in theory, schools and universities are the focus of careful Russian thought and planning, just as they were once the focus of careful Soviet thought and planning. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Red Army in an utterly devastated, occupied East Germany took time away from food provision and road reconstruction or whatever else they were doing to issue an edict banning private kindergartens. And to set up curriculum training sessions for new preschool teachers. That's how important they thought this was. So even when everything else was in chaos, they focused on this as well. Special Soviet commissars were later brought in to control cultural institutions in East Germany. And actually in all of Soviet-occupied Central Europe, institutions of both lower and higher education were used as vectors for the propaganda of the local as well as the Soviet communist parties. And this was planned and thought out from the very beginning. Though in the spring of 2022, Russian occupiers did initially signal their interest in transforming Ukrainian schools. So in Melitopol, which is of course still occupied, The Russian military abducted a handful of school principals, as well as the head of the local Department of Education, although later the principals were released. In Kakhovka, Viktor Pendelchuk, who was the director of school number 1, was detained and interrogated for 2 weeks before escaping to Ukrainian-held territory. Still, a large number of schools in occupied areas did at first remain closed, or else they operated online as they had done in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic. The occupiers began pressuring some educators to return. In one case investigated by the Reckoning Project, witnesses described a geography, math, and computer science teacher, who will also stay anonymous, whose home was visited by Russian soldiers in late June. They handcuffed his 18-year-old son, perhaps because he'd planned to go to university to study Ukrainian history. They put a bag over the teenager's head and they dragged him away. The teacher received a message via an interlocutor telling him that his son was alive, was being fed, and would be returned home if the teacher returned to his job. So the teacher complied. The son did come back, and he too described being interrogated, threatened at gunpoint, and tortured with electric shocks. But by autumn, the occupiers had intensified their efforts to Russify the schools, causing a lot of distress among Ukrainian teachers who feared being accused of collaboration by their own compatriots if they showed up to work. But even then, the process has been pretty haphazard, so differing from place to place. So, and again, some examples. In at least one town in the Zaporizhia region, all Ukrainian language books were removed from schools, including children's books. Elsewhere, only upper level Ukrainian books on law and history were removed. So there's no clear pattern there. The orders seem to be confused. In one Zaporizhian village still under occupation, soldiers have forced schools to open by threatening to take children away from their parents if they don't show up. But elsewhere, low attendance has been tolerated. So the policy seems to depend on who's in charge and what mood they're in. Residents of some areas have said that the occupiers imposed a Russian language curriculum, but many of the lessons were poorly designed. So another example, in one school district, just 4 textbooks were assigned on the Russian language, Russian history, math, and natural science, and all others were discarded. Asked what she had been doing in school during the time Kherson was occupied, a 14-year-old named Alexandra recalled that students spent their time looking at their phones. Higher education suffers from the same kind of erratic policies. Russian soldiers physically occupied Kherson State University, Kherson State Maritime Academy, and Kherson State Agrarian Economic University. But during the time they remained in charge of Kherson, they only held a very small number of classes. And so in June, while the city was still occupied, the Russians announced that Dmytro Kruly, who'd been one of the teachers at the Kherson State Maritime Academy, would become rector. Everyone else would be fired. He had previously taught classes about global maritime distress and safety systems. He announced that the first task of the new university was to build a shipyard, but then no steps were taken in that direction. In other words, this was a kind of unserious decision, unserious announcement taken by somebody who had no expertise in that area. After the liberation of Kherson, Kruly disappeared from the city, probably retreating with the Russians. Quite a lot of evidence suggests that Moscow had bigger plans for Ukrainian schools, but the soldiers on the ground could not implement them. So in Vovchansk, which is a small frontline town in the Kharkiv region, freed in September after 6 months of occupation, the Reckoning Project obtained a copy of a kind of 5-year plan, a 5-year education plan for schools in the city. Document runs to 140 pages of bureaucratic language. It appears to have been mostly copied and pasted from the educational plans given to schools in Russia, as if no special thought went into the needs or demands of newly occupied Ukraine. So there was no special program being created for what were meant to be new Russian territories. No plan that reflected the realities of the situation. And so, for example, the plan called for an annual Day of Solidarity in the fight against terrorism, which was to commemorate the infamous 2004 attack on a school in Beslan in northern Ossetia. There were lessons about the Nazi blockade of Leningrad in World War II, and of course, on the basics of the spiritual, moral culture of the peoples of Russia. But the entire document contains only 2 lines about Vovchansk itself, so mentioning visits to the town's institutions of culture and production sites. So regardless of Moscow's intentions, the Russians actually carrying out the occupation didn't really seem to care what happened in the schools. There was no policy equivalent to the systematic Soviet imposition of Marxist language and history on Central Europe in the 1940s. There was not even an equivalent, at least not yet, to the imposition of a pro-Russian regime in Chechnya after the Second Chechen War. And one example that I've heard described by several different people is that in one occupied town in the Zaporizhia region, teachers were ordered to organize celebrations of May the 9th. This, of course, is the day that Russia marks the anniversary of the Allied victory over Nazi Germany. But the occupying authorities didn't seem to mind very much about what actually happened at these organized celebrations. So whether attendance was high, whether anybody came, whether they learned anything about the war, or whether the celebration was even real, they weren't really bothered. A couple of kids will be enough, these teachers were told. So in other words, this ritual was for show. The point was to tell somebody in Moscow that the event had happened, not to teach any real lessons about World War II or anything else. The truth is, as lots of people in this room will know, each region of Ukraine does have its own history and traditions, and some of them are eerily relevant. So in 1787, 4 years after Russia defeated the Ottoman Empire and annexed the territory of what is now southern Ukraine and Crimea, the Russian Empress Catherine the Great visited the region. The trip was organized by Prince Potemkin, who was once her lover and remained her favorite minister, and it is from this journey that we have inherited the expression Potemkin villages. No, so according to the legend, which is sadly probably not true, Potemkin built facades along Catherine's route, and he populated them with actors in costumes, pulling them down at the end of every day and then putting them up again at the next village so that the Tsarina would see only happy peasants and prosperous homes. As I say, historians doubt that this elaborate piece of theater really happened, but Potemkin's connection to the region was real. He was buried in a crypt in Kherson, right beneath the nave of St. Catherine's Cathedral, which, as I was just telling Serhiy, I happened to have visited 2 weeks ago. As many of you know, the bones are gone. The Russian army took them when they evacuated the city. Perhaps it means that they aren't coming back. Still, the Potemkin village legend persists because it reflects a phenomenon that we recognize, something that we know is familiar, and that's the courtier who creates a false reality to please the distant monarch. And for Ukrainians who have been living under Russian occupation, the Potemkin story helps explain what they've experienced. So Marunyak, the mayor of Starozbrivka, put it like this. He said, "I am following their activities. They are all done for a camera shot in Russia. Even people who live in the occupation don't believe it's for real. It's like a huge Potemkin village. It can't function. They try to glue it together, but it doesn't work." And this sort of Potemkin village tradition might also be a part of the explanation for the really horrific violence that ordinary Russians have inflicted on ordinary Ukrainians. So over and over again, victims told the Reckoning Project journalists that this extreme behavior seemed to come from nowhere. So there was no provocation. Nothing that Ukrainians have done to Russians, either in the distant past or in recent memory, could explain this. They could explain the beatings and the electric shocks and the detention centers, the torture chambers and garages and basements, and this kind of utter disregard for Ukrainian life. Only the Russians' frustration with their own incapacity, their inability to make the Ukrainians obey them, indeed their inability to understand Ukraine at all, might offer a kind of clue. So they were told to transform the cities, to transform the local governments, but they didn't know how. They were told to transform the school systems, but they don't know how. They were told to find the secret Ukrainian organizations, identify the resistance, but, it's kind of everywhere, nowhere. They don't see it. They don't know what it is. So instead, they've identified small town mayors and volunteers. On the one hand, they have to send a report back to Moscow proving that they are in control. On the other hand, they're angry because they exercise so little real control. But of course, this incomprehension also fits into an older tradition. While I was working on this subject, a friend of mine reminded me that back in 1928, the Ukrainian writer Volodymyr Vinnychenko wrote a famous letter to the Russian writer Maxim Gorky, after Gorky had dismissed the Ukrainian language as a mere dialect. Well, Ukraine, Vinnychenko told him, was real, whether or not Gorky wanted it to be real. So what he wrote was, you can think that the Dnipro River flows into the Moscow River, he said. Think it all you want. But the Dnipro will not flow into the Moscow River just because you imagine it does. And so reality has a way of reemerging, of exerting itself, however you try to impose something else on top of it. And I think it's the same today. So wishing Ukraine away or wishing this Ukrainian identity to disappear will not make it disappear. And rewriting history will not alter the historical memories of millions of people. Russia can try to alter the region, but that will not alter the region, no matter how many people are beaten or electric shocks are delivered. I would also say that the modern Russian occupation belongs to an equally old and equally ugly tradition of both Russian imperialism and Soviet genocide. This will be a familiar idea again to many of you here. As so many of you know, Moscow wants to obliterate Ukraine as a separate country and Ukrainianness as a distinct identity. And the occupiers thought that this task would be easy because, like Putin, they assumed that the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian society are weak. That's what they've been told. That's what they read. That's what they tell one another. Even now, I was actually in Kherson a couple of weeks ago and talked to some soldiers who are on the other side of the river and who do a certain amount of listening in to Russian conversations on the other side. And they say, it's amazing to us, but they still do believe the propaganda. They still do believe that, we're a small force that's just going to go away. They haven't accepted that it's the whole population who want them gone, and not just a few soldiers. So that clash between assumption and reality has also forced the occupiers to broaden their use of violence. Wayne Jordash, who's a British barrister documenting Russian war crimes in Ukraine, has argued that the extraordinary number of detention centers in occupied Ukraine represent the Russian army's attempt to fulfill its original plan, which was to capture and kill all the leaders of Ukraine. But as the occupation has dragged on, the idea of leaders got bigger. It was originally Zelensky in the government, and it quite quickly and inevitably became local leaders, which includes everyone from military to civil servants to journalists to teachers, really anybody who had a connection to the Ukrainian state. So one way of explaining and understanding the violence is that the Russians found something they didn't expect to find, and they continue trying to destroy it. And that's the cycle that we're in now. This kind of failure and incompetence leads to violence. The violence, of course, creates more resistance. And that resistance that's so hard for the invaders to comprehend creates wider and broader and ever more random destruction and suffering. And this, of course, is familiar too. This is the logic of genocide. And it's unfolding right now in our time in the occupied Ukrainian territories that have not yet been liberated, in the towns where Russian soldiers are still arresting people arbitrarily on the street, and in the villages where we haven't yet had the possibility to go and count the torture chambers or interview the victims, let alone shut them down. The Stars Borivka remains itself under occupation, although its devoted mayor now lives in exile in Latvia. From there, he tries to keep in touch with his former constituents to help if he can, to advise them or to listen or to kind of keep together the threads of a society that the Russians are haphazardly trying to unravel. They didn't understand anything, Marunyak says now. but just spoiled people's lives. They discovered a world different from the one that they knew. And so they tried to smash it, to destroy it, and they're still trying to destroy it, even as they fail to understand the nature of the civilization that they have encountered. I will stop there. Thank you very much. And I welcome questions on this topic or others.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And please start thinking about the questions. This is the call to everyone who is in the audience, but we also joined online by a significant number of viewers. And while you are thinking, I will ask my first question. First of all, it's amazing on many levels material that you are dealing with, and I really found very productive this references to the research that you did before, which is historical, from the Iron Curtain to Gulag and Red Famine. My question is about whether the sources that you looked at, whether they allow us to also understand the image that emerges in the mind of Ukrainians about the Russians. Who are they? Why they're doing that? Whether there is any reevaluation, rethinking of what Russia is, what Russians are, what the Russian army is. And I'm asking this question partially because of working with some interviews with people who are under occupation. And the Russian aggression started, of course, with the idea that the Ukraine was captured by Nazis and drug addicts and so on and so forth. But from the Ukrainian side, there was basically a lot of pushback in a way that people looked at the occupying army as true fascists, to a degree that when the army comes into the village, what they want to appoint a so-called starosta. So for those who survived World War II, immediately the references are there. They want to put white strips on the arms of people, the lists of people who live in this particular household. So there are the immediate reference historically that was for many of them, either through the films or through the living experience, was the Nazi occupation of 41, 42, 43. So the question is whether this materials that you work with can tell us how the Ukrainians look at that army, how they try to understand that on their own terms.
I mean, of course, what you say is points to an interesting, you know, we all refer to the analogies that we know. I mean, of course, there are many ways in which the Soviet occupation and the Nazi occupations had much more in common than many understood at the time. You know, the idea that you first kill the leaders, you know, then you try and change the place culturally is something that both the Nazis and the Soviet Union did in different ways in the Second World War. I mean, I don't know that this is a good moment to ask Ukrainians for, especially Ukrainians who just survived occupation, for a kind of nuanced analysis of what's happening. I mean, the response that you hear from people either, you know, who have been fighting the Russians or who are living in a town like Kherson or previously Mykolaiv, which are constantly being shelled by Russians, is to see them as some kind of inhuman force. I mean, they use the word orcs, you know, we know, or they talk about Rashists, which is a combination of Russian and fascists, and I think it's and I think that's, you know, the main impression people have is of a dehumanized or dehumanized force that is attempting to dehumanize them. So there's a real lack of any human contact, and when it does occasionally happen, it's very strange and surreal. You know, so I don't know that they see them as imitating Nazis or imitating anything, just that they see them as, you know, they're treating us like animals. They don't see us as people. They see us as, you know, images in a game, or they see, as I said in my short remarks, they see that, you know, they have a responsibility to tell Moscow that they did X or Y, and so they need to make it look like that's what they're doing. But even the gestures that they make, as I said, aren't very deep. So again, there are collaborators, but they don't seem to be meaningful collaborators. Mostly, I mean, there may be some exceptions we don't know about yet, but they seem to be very random people. They're not very effective. They don't have links with Russia that go back very long necessarily. And again, there might be exceptions we'll learn about later. They, you know, they seem, you know, there doesn't seem to be a deep plan or a scheme or an idea for what to do. And so it mostly feels to the Ukrainians like they're, you know, they lob missiles over, you know, they send a telegram back to Moscow and say, you know, we struck a supermarket today and, you know, and a gas station. Is that enough for today? And tomorrow we'll do the same. That's my impression.
Thank you very much. And we have okay. So Megan, let's start with Stephen.
Hi, thank you so much for the brilliant lecture. I saw the microphone was right next to me, so I thought I'd just kick it off. I'm Steve Hansen, visiting scholar at the Minda de Gunsberg Center this year, normally William and Mary. I was wondering if you would go ahead and make the inference from what you have presented that there really are good opportunities for the Ukrainian offensive, counteroffensive this summer with better weaponry. I mean, one of the deductions would be with no real plan, incompetence, random violence, difficulties finding collaboration. This is not like the Soviet or Nazi occupations, thankfully. I mean, not thankfully, that's the wrong word, but the ability to hold territory and create ideological power is nil. So does that mean we're going to see a bunch of people defecting, you know, more of the infighting we've seen with the Wagner group and the regular military? Can you deduce that from what you found, or is that wishful thinking?
So the material that I worked on for this, you know, to understand the nature of the occupation didn't tell me anything about, you know, the morale of the Russian soldiers fighting at Bakhmut. However, other people are working on that and have a lot of evidence. And I mean, as far as we can tell, quite a number of the, you know, there are different pieces of the Russian army. Some of it is still fairly well motivated. They're professional soldiers. As I said, they still believe in the propaganda and they think they're fighting. You know, they're fighting. They still think they're fighting a small force that can be easily toppled or will be eventually. Then there's now this new category of conscripts, Molbiks, many from Russian prisons, as famously, and they seem to be. I mean, a friend of mine thinks they're giving them some kind of drugs. I mean, they look like zombies. They walk, you know, they walk forward into fire when a normal person would run away. It's not clear what's motivating them except for fear or you know, it's not an intellectual motivation. And whether they can revolt or whether they can protest against these conditions is hard to say, because they seem to be already so demoralized that is maybe beyond their capacity. But I don't know. I mean, I don't think anybody has a great insight. You know, the Ukrainians see the Russian soldiers on the ground and they, you know, have captured some of them and speak to them. I don't think anybody has a great insight into the Russian, the commanders, generals, colonels, and what they think of this war, but they can't be happy about it. I would say, actually, just to pick up a point in your question, I mean, in terms of the offensive, which is coming and which people are talking about, the more interesting question is, how organized is the Ukrainian resistance on those territories, and can that make a difference? And that I don't know. I mean, obviously, it's very dangerous to be in the resistance, but it does exist. It does things like, you know, that the Ukrainians have a, this is not a secret, so I can say it. I mean, they have a kind of web platform where anybody can upload photographs or information in a way that's, you know, you know, passport protected. And a lot of the information that the Ukrainian army has comes from ordinary, little old ladies, with their walking canes, taking surreptitious photographs when they walk by a brigade of Russian soldiers just to show them where they are. So there is a way, there's a kind of electronic resistance that exists in the occupied territory. People participate in that. And actually, when I was in Kherson, I spoke to a woman who had been there were a few small resistance cells, even in occupied Kherson before November, who were doing much, what they were doing sounds much more like World War II. They did sabotage, they did a couple of car bombs, that sort of thing. So that exists throughout the region, with, lots of people have fled actually, but it exists, and that could be a factor in later this spring or the summer.
Many thanks for an excellent lecture. I'm Tornik Dimitrieveli. I'm from Georgia. I'm a fellow here at Khoury, visiting for the semester. I have two questions. One question is about the war tactics. It seems to me, at least coming from Georgia, observing Russia's foreign policy for a few decades, targeting civilians is some kind of a war tactics. What do you think of that? Is it kind of a war strategy? Chechnya, Georgia twice, Ukraine, Syria, this kind of the pattern that kind of is replicated. Second thing, you mentioned factors which are really interesting: obsession with conspiracy theories in media, society, or politics, or threat of civil society, volunteerism, charity. These kind of factors are somewhat echoing Putin's personality, and in a way, Russian society became a mirror of Putin. So I wonder what's next for Russian society after Ukraine.
Well, that's an easy question to answer, but no, no, on the first question, the targeting of civilians, it seems to me, has the same function in Ukraine that as terrorism does. In other words, it's not exactly a military tactic in the traditional sense. It's more of a political military tactic. So it has the same goals as, an Al-Qaeda blowing up blowing up an American embassy would have. So the idea is to create anxiety in Ukrainian society, to make people feel despair, to make people not, want to give up and move, to make people not invest, to make people leave the country, to make it ungovernable. In particular, of course, these targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure, on power plants and water treatment plants and so on, that was directly designed to lower the morale of Ukrainian society and to make it ungovernable, or and I think in the hope that will undermine the Ukrainian leadership and make it easier to win the war. I mean, I think that's the direct. I mean, the sort of random lobbing of missiles at Kherson, which was previously the random lobbing of missiles at Mykolaiv, is harder to explain logically. I mean, actually, this is, when you ask Ukrainians why are they doing it, they'll say, oh, they just do it because they're Russians. I mean, which is not a sufficient explanation. But that's the you asked about the impression people have. It's as if it was part of this dehumanized way of seeing the world or behaving. But I think that too also has a kind of political military goal, these are areas that from which, the offensive will come. They want to make it more difficult to operate there. They want it make it difficult to live there and so on. So I think that's the goal of the targeting of civilians. What's next for Russian society? I mean, none of you laughed when I said that was an easy question, but it's very hard to say because I think we don't know very much about Russian society. I have a friend who's part of the Russian opposition, who does a certain amount of polling inside Russia. And there are different ways to do polling there, sort of some online, some with telephones, different tactics. And you can argue about which ones work and which ones doesn't. But he says the main thing to know is that if you ask anybody on a telephone line or in any way that's open, would you, hello, I'm calling from the Levada Center in Moscow. We'd like to do an opinion poll. 9 out of 10 people hang up the phone. So, most polling or most opinion research that you see about Russia is based on the 10% of people who will actually talk to a pollster, which is obviously not representative because that 10% represents the 10% who are willing to do it. Other kinds of ways of measuring public opinion indicate, a lot of skepticism about the war, and on the polls that have been done repeatedly over the last year show that rising. You also have, of course, in Russian society, a kind of learned or trained apathy. As we, again, many of you will know this, the nature of modern Russian propaganda, which is one of the ways it's different from the Stalinist era, is that it sort of persuades people to become apathetic. So what you don't have in Russia is you don't have a kind of 1930s style mobs on the street baying for blood and saying, we want to go to war. You don't have mass signups for mobilization. People have to be tricked or persuaded or forced to fight. And what you have instead is, this kind of people staying out of politics. I don't want to know about it. I don't know what's true or not true. I don't want to, the messages coming from the leadership change all the time, and I don't have any idea what's really happening. And so what you have is a society that's kind of, really does, there isn't really a public sphere there. There isn't a place where people are having debates or discussions. And so it's very hard to know what people really think. And even if I don't want to say if they think at all, because they do think, that sounds more dismissive than I mean, but the idea of thinking about politics is itself dangerous. And so it's better not to have an opinion. And so we're talking about a very large country where a lot of people have been persuaded not to have an opinion, which could be, could bode well in a certain sense, which is that, were there to be a different kind of leadership in Russia, or were there to be some kind of political change, they certainly wouldn't try to stop it. So it's not like there's a deep well of, nationalist imperialist sentiment inside the country that would try to block anybody who tried to end the war. So we don't have that problem, which you could have had in other countries and at other times and places. What comes next? This is a very irritating answer, but what comes next really depends on what happens. I think that the nature of the war, how it is fought in the next year, how it ends, will shape Russia and will shape the Russian leadership so much that it's very hard for me to make any kind of prediction. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I will now go for the questions from online audience, and I will try to do my best combining some of them, or at least bringing them together. So the first question is, can you comment on the importance and status of the Crimea? And sort of related question, I'm trying to do my best to, is the following. There were two recent articles in The Atlantic about the Ukraine war, written from the perspective of international realism. The authors argue that the West should push Ukraine into negotiation, which ultimately means capitulation. What is your response to the proponents of the IR, and will you be responded in The Atlantic? I hope that I'm not putting you in any sort of conflict of.
No. So I mean, this was a tough issue for me. But The Atlantic likes to think of itself as as a magazine that presents a wide range of views. This is not just the case in the war of Ukraine, in the coverage of Ukraine, but also in all kinds of other areas. We sometimes print authors who disagree with one another. And that article, as I understand it, was just, an editor decided to print it as a way of showing, a different view and so on. I mean, my difficulty with the article was that it wasn't just a matter of opinion, it was factually incorrect in a lot of ways. And it was wrong made mistakes about Ukrainian history, especially recent history. And there has been a response published today that corrects some of those mistakes. But, these are, all I can say is I was out of the country when it was published. I have nothing to do with it. I'm not the editor. I'm in the very nice position of genuinely being able to say to people who want to publish in The Atlantic, I am not in control. I cannot get your article in. I can send it to someone else, that's all I can do. So,
Well, wonderful. We certainly accept this answer, but.
no, you asked about Crimea.
If you have any, yeah.
So I think Crimea is emerging as a very significant and important issue in the next part of the war. And this is one of the things that I will be writing about in my article in the Atlantic that has yet to appear, based on my recent trip to Ukraine with the Atlantic's editor-in-chief. So that will come later. It's pretty clear when you look at the map and when you look at what's happened in Crimea over the last 8 years. If you look at the map, we don't have a map of Ukraine here. It's like an aircraft carrier, stuck to the bottom of Ukraine. It has been transformed by the Russians into a kind of, it's a place of, military bases. There are many thousands of soldiers there. They've been digging trenches there, for the last 6 months. It's where the prisons, many of the prisons that contain the kinds of Ukrainians who I spoke about in my remarks, people who are arrested in occupied Ukraine are often in prison in Crimea. So it's a place of real political prisons. Of course, also there are political prisons that contain Crimeans, including over 100 Crimean Tatars. It's also the place where literally the passports and documents, the new Russian passports that are meant to be handed out to the new citizens of Russia who live in occupied Ukraine, are being printed and distributed from Crimea. So Crimea has become the kind of place from which the occupation emanates. I mean, literally it was that at the beginning of the war when soldiers came from Crimea. That's one of several reasons why southern Ukraine fell so quickly, because because Crimea, as I said, it functioned as an aircraft carrier containing Russian troops, and it's becoming hard to see how, whatever arguments you have about the borders of Ukraine and so on, it's very hard to see how a sovereign, independent, flourishing Ukraine, which is a place that people want to invest their money in and which can be integrated into the European Union and the international economy, how it can exist if Crimea remains that kind of militarized project, stuck to its southern coast. Given the importance of the ports, not just Odessa, but the other ports in the south, given the the economic significance of that region, the grain producing regions, it's hard to imagine how the country functions if Crimea remains as it is. There is a lot of conversation about what to do about Crimea. Some of you will know there is actually a Zelensky presidential project that he started before the war, called the Crimean Platform. And there's now there's a kind of, Zelensky has an official representative to Crimea. There's a kind of permanent mission to Crimea that has an office in Kiev. And they have spent the last year more actually making plans for what a deoccupied Crimea would look like. So there are plans on what to do about schools, what to do about property rights. There would be a lot of complications to do with things that were built or property that changed hands in the last 9 years. There are projects to renew or rebuild Crimean Tatar historical and architectural monuments that have been destroyed. There's a kind of concept for how Crimea could be an independent, sort of modern European resort. How to put the Tatars back at the center of that project, how to make them, the owners of Crimea in some sense again. And so there's a lot of discussion of that. There are working groups on each one of these subjects. It sounds probably to people in this room and maybe people outside of Ukraine like a kind of fantasy. Can you imagine this happening? On the other hand, can you imagine any of this? Could you have imagined any of this happening? In February 2022, we were just saying with Serhiy before this, did you imagine that the Ukrainian army would turn out to be a high-tech producer of its own drones? Did we know that there would be this level of US support for Ukraine? Did we imagine almost anything that happened? No, we didn't. And so maybe it's time to begin imagining what a different kind of Crimea would look like too. I mean, I don't want to sound naive, and so on, but I should also say, nobody's talking about, I don't know, crossing the straits with with boats and invading Crimea with tanks. They're talking about, a siege or cutting it off, or of a political change that will make change in Crimea possible. But from what I know, but I think it will, in the next part of the war, it will become a very important and central issue to what a future, as I said, independent, stable and secure Ukraine looks like.
So we're switching back to the audience. Yes.
Thanks so much. Scott Yuri, visiting from Tel Aviv University for the year, affiliated with European Studies, History, and Jewish Studies. There's a lot of rich and difficult material. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what the day-to-day looks like in these areas, in these regions that are occupied by the Russians, what the day-to-day activity is, who's running these towns, how present are the troops in the towns? Are they just come in for a day and then go back again? Either there's a permanent presence, what the day-to-day operation of occupation looks like, and whether that tells us whether there is any kind of plan for what the next step is. And the second question would be, to tease it out a little bit more, the extent to which the more recent invasions in Chechnya, Afghanistan are influencing activities now, as opposed to older invasions in World War II and World War I.
So I can answer this second question more easily. I think the answer is yes, that experiences, from what I understand, experience in Afghanistan and in Chechnya are affect the behavior a lot. I mean, so again, just this small piece of the story, this use of electric shock as a form of torture is something that everybody says was used in Chechnya. It was used in Afghanistan. It's got a long history. And obviously that's not, you don't have to go back to World War II to find some of these interrogation methods. So yes, I think probably the brutality of the army is less to do with World War II and more to do with the way the Russian army has been trained and how it fought in Chechnya and in other more recent wars. It's clear that this whole system of hazing in the army and mistreatment of soldiers has created this very brutal culture, and that brutal culture is part of what we're seeing and part of the explanation for some of the horror of the occupation. As I said, for a lot of Ukrainians, it's kind of mysterious. What did we do to the Russians to deserve this? Why this kind of brutality? And one of the explanations is that these are soldiers who arrived there already brutalized for other reasons and by other things. I mean, in terms of the day-to-day nature of the occupation, I don't know. I mean, I haven't been in occupied Ukraine. But also I don't know that we have enough, I don't know that we know yet really what it's like. I mean, as far as I know from Kherson, one of the things that happened in that situation was a lot of people were able to leave. So a certain number of people left. A lot of people looked simply for ways to survive and get on, which is, of course, what happens in any occupation. I mean, if you look at what happened in occupied Poland and, during the Second World War, 90% of the public just tries to get on with their lives and tries to, tries to continue. A small percentage of people collaborate and a small percentage of people are partisans. And, in this case, as I said, the collaborators seem to be rather random. And the partisans are, small, but are able to work together with the Ukrainian army and maybe even with other intelligence sources and are able to participate somehow in the war. So I think most of the time daily life looks fairly normal. I mean, I think that's probably less true the closer you are to the front line. I mean, again, I was on the river. When you stand along the river, you're looking at Russian troops on the other side. So the closer they are to the border or to the front line, the more it looks like a war zone and not like normal life. And, all along the front line, there's nothing normal happening and no normal life. Further back, as I said, my impression is that most people are trying to get on with things. But I don't, we'll have more granular knowledge and understanding later on. So
I think we can maybe switch side to on this side of the audience.
so you were discriminating against that side.
And Megan, and then Kathleen is over.
Hi, Mikhailo Vinnytsky, originally and soon to be returning to Kyiv Mohyla Academy, but at the moment a research fellow here at Huri. My question actually is going to reference two authors, if you don't mind. One is Peter Pomerantsev and the other is Alexei Yurchak. And I'm really pleased by, or not pleased, but grateful for your sort of characterization of the Russian occupiers as being completely de-ideologized. In other words, there's no reason for doing what they're doing. And that brings up this idea that Pomerantsev in his book calls sort of nothing is true, but everything is possible.
I teach a class with him at Hopkins, so I
Yeah.
know him well.
So
We're co-teaching a seminar this semester.
yeah, and that sort of and the reason I asked because Yurchak brings up this concept of everything is forever until it is no more. And I think in the same way as that Ukrainians are planning for a deoccupied Crimea, perhaps we should be thinking about what Ukrainians talk about when they talk about victory, and that is a post-Russia space. In other words, in the same way as in 1991, we couldn't imagine a post-Soviet space. In the same way, Ukrainians are talking about a post-Russia space. In other words, that the Russian Federation as a political entity does not have a future. And in reality, that is the way that this war ends, in some sort of a reconstitution of the post-Russia space. I'm wondering about your thoughts on that. And secondly, in a scenario where that is de-ideologized, that the population that lives there is completely de-ideologized and sort of everything is possible, and nothing is true. What kind of post-Russia space do we imagine?
It's funny. I mean, I'm less interested in what happened, and I feel not competent to predict what will happen in Russia. In other words, I don't have a scenario that I'm sticking to that and I don't have a reason to think the Russian Federation will fall apart. Nor do I have a reason to think that it will always, when I think about it, I can imagine a scenario by which, a moment when orders are given in Moscow and they aren't followed, which is a little bit what happened in 1991. It wasn't so much that there was a crash or some dramatic thing, or there was like a war, it was just that people stopped doing what Moscow told them. So you can imagine, I don't know, some bits of Siberia saying we won't pay taxes anymore, or some other part of the country not wanting to cooperate. I imagine that more than some big dramatic change. And for all kinds of administrative and other reasons, I can imagine the Russian Federation hanging around for quite a long time, as even as it becomes less functional. What interests me more is the question of there's one change in Russia that has to happen. And what interests me more is how that happens. And that is the moment when the Russian elites or the Russian leader or whoever is calling the shots in Russia at a given moment, at the moment when they understand, themselves and are able to say that the war was a mistake and that Ukraine is an independent country. And this is the moment, this is the change that the British went through in Ireland following the Irish Revolution, the Easter Rising and so on at the beginning of the 20th century, when they looked at Ireland, which they had, by the way, talked about a little bit like the way the Russians used to talk about the Ukrainians, as a bunch of peasants who can't rule themselves. And of course, they don't have their own language. They all speak English. But there became a moment when they said, right, they're not a part of Great Britain. They can have their own country. And then we had many more decades of conflict in Northern Ireland, but that's, but the Irish Republic, they let it go. It's okay, they're not us, and we're not going to try and make them us anymore. And there was a similar moment that happened in France in the context of Algeria and the Algerian War. Where Algeria was not, okay, it wasn't a land empire in the same way, but it was meant to be metropolitan France. And there were many French people who had moved to Algeria and who lived in Algeria and thought of themselves as French Algerians. And there were deep links between Algeria and France that to many people seemed, we are one country now. And yet there also came a moment when the French elite, and this was a very tumultuous moment in French history. There was a coup d'etat attempt in Paris, and there were, all kinds of rogue generals who were very angry. And there was a lot of conflict and drama, and actually a collapse of the French, the French constitutional system at the time were to replace by others. It had a lot of political impact inside France itself. But nevertheless, there was this moment when people said, okay, Algeria is a separate country. And so that moment has to come in Russia. And the question is, what makes it come? And there isn't a formula, I can't tell you, it will happen next Tuesday, for these 6 reasons. But and there is a certain amount of thinking, and again, many of you know this in Kiev, about how to make it happen. What is the defeat? What is the battle we have to win? What is the thing that needs to happen to make that change? And maybe it's even just the threatening of Crimea rather than the conquest. Maybe it's taking back Mariupol. Maybe there's a battle that they could win. And then, once that has happened, then I think that's the most important change in Russia. And then a lot of different things could happen, some positive and some negative. I mean, it's my view, and I've said this before, that whoever comes after Putin is better. Whoever, the worst person you can think of is still better, because that person will not have the same legitimacy and the same amount of power that he does, because that person will immediately be the focus of infighting and conflict, and it will take a long time to reassert that kind of power and control, and because that person won't be the one who's directly responsible for the war. So I can only hope that happens, and I don't know that it will. And the change that I spoke of before, I don't know that it requires that or not. Maybe it does. Sarah, he thinks it does, but I don't know. Maybe he'll wake up in the one morning and he'll just change his mind. But anyway, Putin, I mean, not Sergei. But these are, this is just, this is just speculation. I mean, I don't think it's useful for anyone here to work towards a particular outcome in Russia in that sense. I mean, regime change is not going to, regime change is not going to happen because of something we do. And the future state of Russia will be decided by the Russians. We can discuss the various possibilities and outcomes and why some of them would be good or bad, but I don't know that that's productive. But thinking about how to achieve this one particular change of heart, which would also affect Russia's view of the region and of Europe, is to me the most important thing.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Catherine Katz. I'm a writer and historian. I'm also at Harvard Law School. And I recall reading a passage by the Marquis de Custine about traveling in Russia in the 1830s, where he writes that toleration has no guarantee, neither in public opinion nor in the constitution of the state. It's a guarantee offered by one man, and he may take away tomorrow what he's granted today. And of course, that's the Tsar. that was in the context of religious toleration. But if you then fast forward to the Soviet era, you have a consistent, credible commitment problem where any agreement made is torn up as soon as it no longer suits the state's interest to keep it. So why do you think it's been so difficult, kind of from the Russian Empire to the Soviet period to today, for Western leaders that don't operate that way and don't have that kind of interaction with other world leaders in making and keeping agreements? Why is it so hard for Western leaders, especially in the United States or Britain, to shift the frame of mind that it's not like negotiating a peace deal or any other agreement with another head of state or entity?
I mean, that's really, that's a psychological question that I might not be equipped to answer. I mean, it's all of us want to see in other people, a mirror of ourselves. And, we think this way, so why can't other people think this way? I mean, it's funny though, I think during the Cold War, at least the early part of the Cold War, I don't think people thought of, Stalin or even Khrushchev as being like us. And they did think it was a different way of thinking and behaving. And they did understand that, there's a different mentality. I think that what happened in particular, since the end of the Cold War, since 1989, it's almost like we had, we developed this frame of thinking about Russia, and also, incidentally, not just Russia, China and others, that said, all right, we don't all agree about everything, but, there are areas of rationality where we all share the same interests. At least we have the same interests. And there was this belief that's mocked now, but was held very sincerely at the time, which is that, if we involve the Russians in a web of economic interests, or the Chinese in a web of economic interests, then, maybe they won't become exactly like us, but they'll become kind of civilized and they'll become part of our world, and we'll all share the same, the WTO and the, and various trade agreements, and we can operate them, at least there'll be some basis for, for commerce and trade, and that will lead to better conversation, and there'll be that we all share something that we can rationally discuss. And I think the assumption, I mean, that was the assumption behind Germany's intensive relationship with Russia. I mean, again, bad though it looks now, I think it started out as a belief that, if we want to live well with the Russians and we want to get along with them, they're a power on this kind. A lot of Germans are still afraid of the Russians quite deep down, I think. Then what we need to do is have this, deep trade links that can't be broken, because at the end of the day, people's economic interests will always be there. And my feeling is that's now been broken. The degree to which the Russians were willing to sacrifice their own economic interest and sacrifice their own prosperity has begun to make inroads into Western thinking about Russia, or not just Russia actually, but about that whole set of assumptions. Our assumptions that, at the end of the day, everybody's rational and they have self-interest and they want to trade stuff. And that seems to me one of the casualties of this war is that idea. But you're right. I mean, it was for a long time, it was something about the many years we had of peace and the many years that we had of, of this idea that the world could be run as an economic project, that I think created that impression.
Thank you very much. Technically, we are out of time, so we can go maybe without completely exhausting our speaker for another 15 minutes. We have, I understand, already 4 people here, so maybe we'll gather questions here. And I have also, I'm the only advocate here for people who are online. So maybe we'll collect questions here, and you will provide answers to the questions that you really like. And then there will be also the questions coming from online, and then unfortunately we'll have to conclude.
If there are going to be a lot of questions, I'm going to have to write them down.
Now? Great admirer of your work, Anne. It's a treat to be here. Thank you. I am curious to know more about the project. I've waited so long, I forgot the name, the Reckoning
Reckoning
Project.
Mhm.
Could you say more about its beginnings? How did it get started? How much of a role did you play in getting it started? And is there a book we might expect based on all the stories you're collecting from them?
So I should be clear that I'm not part of it. I mean, I don't run it. It's run by colleagues. Oh, you want me to do more questions? Okay, well, I'll just do this one. In fact, Peter Pomerantsev had a role. It was set up by a couple of Ukrainian journalists who, the idea was that, very early on in the war, it became, I think particularly after Bucha, it became clear that, there were these terrible human rights violations. And there are a number of groups collecting information about war crimes and so on all over Ukraine. There are some legal groups. Obviously, the human rights organizations are there. The Ukrainian state, of course, is doing this. I mean, I've seen it in action. They also have their local policemen are now being trained for how to write down and describe, an attack or a crime in a way that would be acceptable for an international court. So there's a lot of people are working on this, and this is just one of many groups. The only thing that's specific and different about it is that they are, human rights organizations will usually go in and they have a sort of formula when they interview people. We need to know certain things about what happened, and this is because they're collecting certain kinds of information that will then be presented at a tribunal. And this project tries to do something a little bit more than that. So it collects a lot of, it does long interviews, it does, to try and get nuance and detail. And then it hopes to, some of that material will be used also for courts, but some of it they hope will be used in journalism. And so what I used for this project was just one fraction of what they do. They've done a couple of documentaries. They have, I mean, they don't have a website yet. I'm sure they eventually will. Obviously they're new. They were created since the war started. But I think they've just raised a bunch more money. So I think over the next couple of years, they'll begin to produce more. I think there are other ideas to work with other organizations. So they did a project with Time Magazine, and they've done a couple of other projects with other newspapers and magazines. So the idea is to get the stories into media that people actually read. So.
Okay, thanks. So our second attempt at collecting the questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your work. And just wanted to ask you to build on top the things that you already said about Russians who are not willing to make any changes in their own country. I wanted to ask you about Russians who left Russia, those, the 500,000 that are abroad. Do you see any hope that the change start abroad?
Okay, thank you.
I have a comment. So, well, first of all, I'd like to say that there are relatively few people who are, as they say, for real, and you're one of them. I'd like to thank you for that. And now just a short comment. For no particular reason, I had to vacate the bookshelves. I've been looking through, browsing and reading some copies of 70s and 80s of Continent. This is the dissident magazine published in Paris. And for those who don't know, it's a publication with people like Solzhenitsyn, Brodsky, Galich, so the creme de la creme of Russian exile intelligentsia. And I was struck by the fact that how irrelevant that is today.
Relevant or irrelevant?
Irrelevant.
Irrelevant.
How irrelevant. So number one, it has as if the whole 20th century passed by them. So this is the ethos of Russian intelligentsia circa 19th century, with all it hangs up, indignation and stuff like that. And another thing that I noticed is that there is no such thing as the Soviet, there is Russian. That's my particular conclusion after reading through these materials. I was particularly interested in Viktor Nekrasov, who is a, what they say, a decent guy, the author of В окопах Stalingrada. And he is a Kievite. I myself consider myself a Kievite. So and he's describing Kiev of early 70s. This is my time, formative years. So, and he's totally, just like other authors, totally blind to the national issue. This is, the whole idea was that once communism is removed, we all live like brothers. The whole idea of nationality, national rights, independence, sovereignty is totally beyond these guys. And I'd like your comment on that.
I didn't hear all of that, but I think I can comment.
But I meant well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your fantastic presentation today and for all the important work that you are doing. My name is Lech Kutsuba. I work at the Ukrainian Research Institute. And my question, since you also teach, my question would be more about the state of the field, if you wish, in studying the region. So the region that consists of Russia, but also Eastern Europe and kind of the countries in that area. And we know that for several decades since World War II, Russia, of course, dominated the space in how the space was studied. Right? If we speak about Slavic studies, usually we understand it's all Russian studies, and then a couple of sprinklings of Polish and Ukrainian and whatever else kind of makes it in there. And so, of course, the Ukrainian Research Institute as a project was created to kind of decentralize that space and to, provide more opportunity for scholars studying other nations or cultures to kind of get in and maybe reclaim some of that knowledge, but also present it as a relevant one. However, as we see currently from the debates with our colleagues and friends at the universities and elsewhere, most of them seem at least to be less concerned about the lives and the loss of lives of Ukrainians and more about how they will continue studying Russian art, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and literature and all of that right now as the work goes on and in the aftermath of the war. And so my question is more about the transformation of the field that you see or that you think should happen, and also about what else can be done to shift the focus away from quote unquote great Russian anything to just Russian and just Polish, Ukrainian, and others. Thank you.
Answer questions. So I'll answer the last one first. I hope all of you are like ready and prepared, because the golden age of Ukrainian studies is about to arrive, so do you have a lot? I hope you have a lot of energy, and you got new courses you want to teach, and you have some program teaching people how to speak Ukrainian, because, I know it just from the number of my friends who call me, their daughter is 18. She wants to take a year off before college. She wants to go to Poland or Ukraine to work with Ukrainians. What does she do? And so, I now have people who I know to call, and I know what questions to ask for, does she speak any relevant languages? No, but, I really think there's never been a moment when people have been as interested. And, and I speak here as somebody who wrote a book about Ukraine right before this happened and had publishers who didn't think it was that interesting and then got very excited about it later on. So, I think the shift is happening already. I mean, these things take years to work through whatever. I mean, you people know more about university departments and tenure and so on. It's already going on. I mean, and of course, there are always going to be people who study Dostoevsky and Russian art history, just like there are people who study, Proust and French art history. So, they'll exist, and we need them too. And I don't see why they shouldn't keep doing it, but I do think there is going to be huge interest going forward in the history of Ukraine, in in understanding Ukraine and understanding the geopolitics, in studying and working there. You know, fingers crossed, after the war, people will want to go there. There will be a lot to do there. Young people want to go there. I mean, I know, as I said, I know lots already, and I think there will be more. So I just hope everyone here is gearing up for it. Yeah. You know, the other two questions were about Russians. I mean, you know, so you know, it's not that I'm I don't want to be naive, but I also don't want to be, you know, it's very important not to be, to remember that nothing is inevitable and no countries are ever condemned to be a certain way, that there isn't a law of history that says Russia has to be the way it is because it was always Russia. You know, you were of course right to quote earlier the Marquis de Custine, because so much of what he says, including there's a version of Potemkin villages that he sees on his trip as well, that, you know, that remains relevant today. But countries do change, you know, and stuff does happen that makes them different. I mean, Ukraine is one of the countries that I know that's changed the most, you know, almost more than anybody else. I mean, Poland has also changed, but you know, the difference between Ukraine in 1990 and Ukraine now is enormous. You know, countries change, they evolve, things happen, they have different kinds of leaders push them in one direction or another. And I really refuse to say that Russia can't change. You know, I really won't. I don't believe that. And of course, you know, the question is, where would the change come from? You know, we already talked about this a little bit. The exiles might turn out to be important. It was very funny. I have one Russian friend who was really one of the last Russian opposition people left, and she was threatened with arrest, and so she finally left Moscow a few months ago. And I was talking to her about Russian exiles, and she was actually saying, "Oh, nothing good can ever come of exiles. You know, the only thing that, you know, the only real change has to come from in. You know, there's never been any exiles who've done anything before in Russian history." I was like, "Wait a second," and she said, "You're not going to tell me Trotsky, are you?" And I said, "Yes, I was just going to say Trotsky." So, you know, there is this tradition of exiles changing Russia, and maybe it's an ugly tradition, and maybe that's not the kind of change you want, and those aren't the kind of exiles you want. But it's there. I mean, it's part of what happened before. You know, and there is a part of the exile. I can't speak to every single exile, and you know, sure, some of them were opportunists who just didn't want to fight in the war, and you know, some of them are just like tech guys who were mad that they were cut off from the internet. You know, but there is certainly a part of the exile community that is, you know, that is political, that would like their country to be different, that is very devastated by what's happened, that isn't imperialist and isn't, you know, that, you know, deeply regrets and is sorry and embarrassed by the war. And some of those people will go on working in Russian language media. Some of them are doing it now. Some of them will, you know, will organize in some ways outside the country. I mean, I think right now they're all very, you know, they're disoriented, and they're at the stage of trying to figure out like where their kids are going to go to school and so on. I mean, there's a moment of being pushed out of the country where the first part of it is logistical rather than intellectual. But, you know, it's really, you know, I think the war has had, you know, this change that I spoke of inside Russia. I think it's happened already in a lot of the liberal Russian community. They understand, you know, what a catastrophe the Crimean invasion was, and they're willing to say so. And I think that should be encouraged. I mean, you know, there's nothing inevitable. There's nothing genetic about the Russian regime, and there will be, you know, and I would also say there are pieces and stories from Russian history that they can draw on. I mean, modern Russia, really, it was the modern Soviet Union, but invented the modern human rights movement. I mean, there's a tradition of dissidents in Russia. There's a tradition of, you know, a small but important tradition of liberal politics in Russia, and they will continue to draw on it and try and develop it. And it might be a long-term project, but sometimes, you know, long-term projects have an impact. So I don't want to feel hopeless about Russia. And I do think that, you know, some of the exiles will try and be part of whatever change is coming. I'll say it like that.
Thank you very much. Some technical detail, not a big statement. Trotsky came from Kherson. Two questions that I have here, and again, they're not maybe closely related. The first one is, please say more about the genocide intents and the Russianism ideology. And the second is, did Putin's decision to keep the invasion plans closely held to a few advisors mean the Russian army never had an opportunity to prepare an occupation plan? And this will be our two concluding questions.
So the second question, the reason why, well, if it's partly, part of why there was no occupation plan was that, Putin was keeping the truth about the invasion quiet. But I think the bigger reason was that Putin had had a completely different theory of what was going to happen. His theory was that there wasn't going to need to be an occupation in that sense because the Ukrainian government was going to fall quickly. Zelensky would be dead or in exile. He would be replaced, I don't know, by Medvedchuk or by, Yanukovych would come back on a horse or something. I don't know exactly what the plan was, but somebody would come back and run Ukraine as a pro-Russian Ukrainian, and that most people would accept it. The idea was that the Ukrainian elite is small and unpopular, and most Ukrainians don't support it, and most of them will welcome this reunification with Russia. And I think Putin at least believed that, and maybe he believed it because people were saying it to him, and knowing what he wanted to hear over the past decade. Or maybe, remember, he's somebody who has very little contact with modern Ukraine or Ukrainians. He doesn't know very much about it. He's spent very little time with any Ukrainian. So he's, so he didn't see it. And I think that was what they didn't think they were going to have to do any kind of transformation or, thinking about how to, because they thought that just eliminating the leadership would be enough. And then, as I say, when they actually arrived in Kharkiv or Kherson or Zaporizhia, they discovered actually there were all these other leaders, these mayors and city councilors who had real authority and had real legitimacy because they were elected. And that was the thing they didn't know about and they hadn't considered. So that would be my answer to that. I mean, genocide. I don't have any doubt that what the Russians are doing is, in the broadest sense of the word, in the Raphael Lemkin description, definition, is clearly genocidal. I mean, it's the idea is to erase, eliminate Ukrainian culture, destroy the Ukrainian language, kill, if not every single Ukrainian, then many of them. To remove people from the land and then maybe eventually replace them with Russians. I mean, in a way, the signature policy here is not really the torture and so on that I was describing in my talk, but it's really the theft of children, which is one of the most, in some ways, the most diabolical thing that they've done. I mean, this capturing children, it's happened in different ways. I mean, you all know the stories. I mean, some of it is orphanages, some of it is people in occupied territories who sent their children to summer camps. And the idea of capturing children, taking them to Russia, telling them their parents don't want them anymore, making them learn Russian, teaching them to be Russians. I mean, this is a clear attempt to erase Ukrainians and create people, make them into Russians, into something else. And that seems to be, as I say, I don't think that the Russians had thought it would be necessary at scale. So they imagined that lots of Ukrainians would voluntarily become Russians because that's what they thought. They thought all Russian speakers were Russians, the way the British used to think all English speakers were English. So it's not all, it's not well planned and systematic, but clearly the intention is genocidal. So I don't have any problem using that word in the context of the occupation.
Certainly ran out of questions here online. We probably have no chance of running out of questions here in the audience, but we have to end it at some point, and I guess this is the point where we're ending. And I want to thank Anne Applebaum once again for really very interesting, very thought-provoking presentation, but also for answering questions and in the most effective way possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before you left and before I forgot, there is this is not the last event that happens during this semester, sponsored by the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. We all looking forward to you coming back on Monday, April the 3rd at 4:30. The event will be Harvard Hill Ukraine Group and Ukrainian clinical scholars speak about healthcare challenges in Ukraine. I'm looking forward to welcoming you back to one of our events, or rather one of the co-sponsored events by the Institute. Thank you.